Hi, everyone. Today we're talking about the reading skill of literary elements. I'm Mrs. Giroux, and we've been reading lots of stories in Module 1. One of the stories we read was Scaredy Squirrel. So we're going to be using Scaredy Squirrel as we talk about this anchor chart of literary elements. Literary means anything to do with a story. So elements are the parts of the story. Literary elements means parts of the story. And every story will have these parts. There are four main parts. The first part is the characters. Those are the people and even the animals in a story. So if we go over to Scaredy Squirrel, we know that Scaredy Squirrel himself is a character in our story. And even though he's an animal, he is the main character of our story. Sometimes we have people characters, and in Scaredy Squirrel, we only have animal characters, really. Let's go back to our literary elements. Our second element, part that makes up a story, is the setting, where and when the story takes place. This affects the plot because certain events happen in certain settings. And it also affects the plot by creating a certain mood. If we go over to Scaredy Squirrel, we know that the setting of the story is in a tree. For most of the time, Scaredy Squirrel is in his tree, and it kind of sets the mood that Scaredy Squirrel is afraid to go anywhere else, right? He doesn't want to go out into the unknown. He doesn't want to jump out of his tree. He's a little scared of all of that stuff. Now, the setting also involves the time that something happens. Now, in Scaredy Squirrel, that tree is pretty much going to be the same. Trees are the same no matter if it's 20 years ago or today. But if we were telling a story in Carson City in the year 2010, that would be different than Carson City in 2020 when coronavirus is going on, right? So the time that it's happening is really important. For Scaredy Squirrel, we would say the setting is happening in a tree and it's happening now. It could happen now or anytime. Let's go back to the third element of our stories. Literary element number 3 is the plot. The plot of the story is the conflict, the main problem that the characters face, and the resolution, how that conflict or problem is solved. And the plot also involves events. That's element number 4, things that happen in the story. It helps build the plots. So our events happen throughout the story. It shows us what our conflict is and how our conflict gets resolved. So if we go over to Scaredy Squirrel, we know the plot of the story is that he is afraid to leave his tree. He has a lot of fears, doesn't he? And his life is kind of boring. He lives in this tree all the time. Even though he's going around all different days to different parts of the tree, he's never leaving the tree. And there's some advantages and there's some disadvantages to that. But his problem is that he's too afraid to change his schedule. He even has an emergency kit full of stuff to make sure that he doesn't run into any danger. And he has an escape plan, emergency plan, if he has to leave the tree for any reason, only under an emergency, right? But the problem with this is that one day, something that scares Scaredy Squirrel comes along, and this is an event in the story. So the event of when the killer bee appears and knocks Scaredy Squirrel out of the story changes how the story goes, and it affects his problem. His problem of wanting to stay in the tree because he's afraid of everything has now been affected by the event of the killer bee showing up. So he gets knocked out of the tree and then he learns, big event, that he's a flying squirrel, right? So another event in the story is that he's a flying squirrel. And finally, another event after he flies is that he plays dead for 2 hours. So lots of events in our story that kind of progress our problem, and Scaredy Squirrel realizes that he doesn't have to stay in his tree forever, and now he has a new routine. He's learned to change his life around a little bit and learns that maybe he doesn't need to be afraid of everything. So his conflict of wanting to stay in his tree all the time and being afraid of everything gets resolved by accident when the event of the killer bee comes and he accidentally falls out of the tree and learns that he's a flying squirrel. So that is what literary elements are. They're the elements of our story. They make up our story, and they certainly make stories a lot of fun. We love to have interesting characters. We love to have a great setting maybe something we can relate to, or a setting that is totally different from our lives and where we live and how we live. And in every story, we have to have some sort of problem that the characters are trying to solve. That's what builds the plot and makes the story interesting. All right, I hope you liked learning about literary elements today, and think about the literary elements in your story.